They say you never forget the moment your world collapses. For me, it was 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in November, and the sound that shattered my life wasn't an explosion or a crash. It was the simple ring of my bedside phone. I'd been sleeping deeply for the first time in months, finally at peace after years of watching my son struggle, believing he'd finally turned his life around. The voice on the other end belonged to Detective Morrison from the county sheriff's office. His words hit me like sledgehammers. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm sorry to inform you that your son, Jake Sullivan, was found deceased in his apartment earlier this evening. If you've ever received that kind of call, the one that splits your life into before and after, then you know what happened next." Time stopped. The room spun. Every sound became muffled like I was underwater. But what the detective said next, that's what would haunt me for months to come. "Sir, we need you to come down to identify the body. And there's something else. We found evidence that suggests this wasn't an accident." Now, before I tell you what I discovered that night, what my daughter-in-law Melissa was hiding, and why I made the decision that would consume the next 2 years of my life, I need you to understand something. If this story moves you, if it makes you think about the secrets in your own family, hit that subscribe button. Because what I'm about to share with you isn't just my story. It's a warning about trust, about greed, and about what happens when you underestimate a 68-year-old man who has nothing left to lose. Jake was my only child. My wife Sarah died when he was 12, and I raised him alone through his teenage years, his struggles with addiction, his failed marriages, and finally, what I thought was his recovery. We'd grown closer in the months before his death than we'd been since he was a boy. He'd been calling me every Sunday, talking about his plans, his future, how he wanted to make things right. The last time I saw him alive, he pulled me aside after dinner and said something that didn't make sense at the time. "Dad, if anything ever happens to me, don't trust anyone, not even family. Promise me you'll be careful." I laughed it off, told him nothing was going to happen. But Jake's eyes, they were serious in a way I'd never seen before. Dark, worried, like he knew something I didn't. Standing in that sterile morgue at 5 a.m., looking down at my son's face, I remembered those words. And when Detective Morrison started asking me questions about Jake's relationship with his wife, about their finances, about whether I knew anything about a life insurance policy, something cold settled in my chest. "Mr. Sullivan," the detective said, consulting his notepad, "your daughter-in-law mentioned that your son didn't have much in the way of assets, said the family was struggling financially, but we found some inconsistencies in the apartment, things that suggest maybe there was more going on than she indicated." Melissa, my son's wife of 3 years, the woman who'd swept into Jake's life during his recovery, who'd seemed so supportive, so loving, the woman who'd called me sobbing just hours after the police found Jake's body, crying about how they were going to lose everything, how she didn't know how she'd survive without him. But here's what I hadn't told Detective Morrison yet, what I couldn't bring myself to say out loud. 3 weeks before Jake died, he'd called me about updating his will. He'd been secretive about it, said he was making some changes, ensuring that the right people got what they deserved. He'd asked me to meet him at his lawyer's office, said there were things he wanted me to know, provisions he was making. We were supposed to meet that Friday. Jake died on Thursday night. The detective was still talking, but his words faded into background noise as a terrible realization began to form. Jake's warning, his insistence on updating his will, Melissa's immediate concern about finances, the inconsistencies in the apartment. "Detective," I finally said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I think there are some things about my son's estate that we need to discuss, things his wife might not have mentioned." What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have imagined, was that Jake had been more thorough than I'd ever given him credit for. In the weeks that followed, as I began to piece together the truth, I discovered that my son hadn't just been planning for his death. He'd been documenting everything, recording conversations, building a case, because Jake knew exactly who was going to kill him. That first morning, Driving home from the morgue as the sun came up over the mountains, I made a decision. I wasn't going to be the grieving father who quietly buried his son and moved on. I wasn't going to let whoever had done this think they'd gotten away with it. But I also wasn't going to rush in blindly. If Jake had taught me anything in his 34 years, it was that addiction made people desperate, and desperate people were dangerous. I needed to be smart. I needed to be patient. I needed to become someone I'd never been before. The first stop was Jake's apartment. Melissa had given me a key, sobbing about how she couldn't bear to go back there, how she needed my help going through his things. The police had finished their investigation, she said. We could take whatever we wanted. Walking into that apartment felt like stepping into a tomb. Jake's coffee mug was still on the kitchen counter, half full and growing mold. His work clothes were draped over the back of a chair. Everything looked normal, peaceful, like he'd just stepped out for a minute. But I wasn't there to grieve. Not yet. I was there to learn. And what I learned in that apartment, hidden in places that Melissa would never have thought to look, changed everything I thought I knew about my son's last few months. Jake hadn't just been getting his life together. He'd been fighting for it. In his bedroom closet, taped to the inside of an old shoebox, I found a cell phone I'd never seen before, a burner phone still charged. When I powered it up, I found dozens of recorded calls, conversations between Jake and people whose voices I didn't recognize, conversations about money, about debts, about things that needed to be taken care of. But it was the last recording that made my blood run cold. A conversation between Jake and Melissa, dated just 2 days before he died. I sat on my son's bed, holding that phone with shaking hands, and listened to my daughter-in-law's voice. Calm, calculated, nothing like the hysterical widow I'd comforted just hours earlier, discussing the details of my son's murder. I must have played that recording 20 times before I could process what I was hearing. Melissa's voice clear as day, discussing Jake's life insurance policy with someone she called Tommy. Not the broken-hearted widow I'd held in my arms at the hospital. This was someone else entirely. Someone cold, calculating, impatient. The policy's been active for 18 months, she was saying. That's well past the suicide clause. As long as it looks like an accident or, natural causes were clear. Jake's voice came through strained, desperate. Melissa, please. We can work this out. I know about Tommy. I know about the drugs you've been moving through the shop. But I'm not going to turn you in. I just want out. Let me take my share and disappear. Your share? Melissa laughed, and it was a sound I'd never heard from her before. Harsh, cruel. Baby, you don't have a share anymore. You lost that when you started recording our conversations. That's when I realized Jake hadn't just stumbled onto something. He'd been investigating his own wife. The recording continued for another 12 minutes. Melissa and this Tommy person, who I was beginning to realize was her brother, the one she'd always described as troubled but never let us meet, laid out their plan in detail. Jake was getting too close to their operation. He'd been asking too many questions about the auto repair shop Melissa had bought with money she claimed came from her grandmother's estate. Questions about the customers who paid in cash, who picked up their cars at odd hours, who seemed more interested in the trunk space than the engine work. My son had figured out that his wife was running drugs through her business. More than that, he'd documented it. And according to the recording, he'd hidden evidence somewhere safe, somewhere Melissa would never find it. That's when Tommy's voice turned dark. Look, we've got two choices here. Either Jake disappears permanently or we all go to prison. And I'm not going to prison for some junkie who thinks he can play detective. He's not a junkie anymore, Melissa had replied. But her voice was tired, resigned. He's been clean for 8 months. Doesn't matter, he's still a liability. What happened next on that recording? I had to stop the phone and pour myself 3 fingers of whiskey before I could continue listening, because that's when my daughter-in-law, the woman who'd stood beside my son at their wedding and promised to love him in sickness and in health, signed his death warrant. Fine, she said, but make it look like an overdose. He's been to rehab twice, everyone will believe it. The recording ended there. I sat in Jake's bedroom for 2 hours, staring at that phone, trying to process what I'd just heard. My son had known his wife was planning to kill him, and he'd recorded her confession. But why hadn't he gone to the police? Why hadn't he run? The answer came to me as I started searching the rest of the apartment more carefully. Jake hadn't just been collecting evidence against Melissa. He'd been protecting something else. Someone else. Hidden in his desk drawer, underneath a false bottom I almost missed, I found a letter addressed to me, written in Jake's handwriting, dated the day before he died. Dad. If you're reading this, then Melissa and Tommy got to me before I could get to the police. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you everything when I had the chance, but I needed to protect you. And I needed to protect Emma. Emma, my son's daughter from his first marriage, my granddaughter who lived with her mother in California. What did she have to do with any of this? Melissa doesn't know about the trust fund. She doesn't know about the house in Colorado or the cars or the money I've been putting away since I got clean. She thinks I'm broke, that the insurance money is all there is. Let her think that. But Dad, Emma's going to need that money for college, for her future. And Melissa, she's not who we thought she was. The shop is just a front. She's been moving product for Tommy's crew for 2 years. Hard stuff, the kind that kills people. I've been recording everything, documenting everything. The evidence is in safety deposit box 247 at First National downtown. The key is taped under the bathroom sink in the apartment we looked at on Maple Street. Remember? The one I said I was thinking about renting? I never told Melissa about that place. If something happens to me, don't go to the local police. Tommy's got connections there. Go to the state attorney's office. Ask for Detective Linda Chen. She's clean and she's been investigating Tommy's operation for months. Give her everything. But first, Dad, get to that safety deposit box. Get the real will. The one Melissa doesn't know about. Because what she's expecting to inherit, it doesn't exist. I moved everything into Emma's trust 6 months ago. The house, the cars, the insurance money. It all goes to Emma when she turns 18. Melissa gets nothing. I'm sorry I got you mixed up in this. I'm sorry I couldn't be the son you deserved. But maybe I can still do one right thing. Maybe I can still protect the people I love. Watch your back, Dad. And whatever you do, don't let Melissa know what you found. I love you. Jake. I read that letter 3 times before the full weight of it hit me. My son hadn't just been murdered. He'd been systematically betrayed by the woman he'd trusted with his life. Robbed by people who saw him as nothing more than an obstacle to their greed. But Jake had been smarter than they'd given him credit for. Even in death, he'd found a way to protect his daughter and expose his killers. The question was, what was I going to do about it? Sitting there in my dead son's apartment, holding evidence that could send his murderers to prison, I realized I had a choice to make. I could follow Jake's instructions, take everything to the authorities, and let justice take its course. Or I could do something else. Something that the old me, the man who'd spent 68 years playing by the rules, trusting the system, believing that good people got good outcomes, would never have considered. I could make them pay myself. The idea should have horrified me. A month earlier, it would have. But something had changed in me that morning in the morgue, listening to Detective Morrison's questions, seeing the calculating look in Melissa's eyes when she thought I wasn't watching. Jake had been right about one thing. I needed to be careful. But he'd underestimated me in another way. He thought I was just a grieving father who needed protection, who needed to be shielded from the truth. He didn't realize that losing him had awakened something in me I didn't know existed, something cold, something patient, something that understood that sometimes justice and revenge were the same thing. I folded Jake's letter carefully and put it in my jacket pocket. Then I took that burner phone and every other piece of evidence I'd found and I walked out of that apartment. Melissa was waiting in the parking lot. "Frank," she called out, hurrying toward me with tears in her eyes. "How are you holding up? This must be so hard for you. I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since Jake's death. The concerned expression, the trembling voice, the way she reached out to touch my arm in comfort. It was all an act, and it was a good one. I'm managing, I told her, just trying to understand what happened. The police said it was an overdose, she said, and I watched her carefully for any tell, any sign that she was lying. But Melissa was good, very good. I guess he was using again and we just didn't know. I guess so, I agreed. Then I did something that surprised both of us. I smiled. But at least we have each other now. We're family. We'll get through this together. The relief that flashed across her face was so brief I almost missed it. But it was there. She thought I was just the grieving father she could manipulate, the old man she could fool. She had no idea what she'd just woken up. 3 days later, I stood outside First National Bank at exactly 9 a.m., waiting for them to open. I'd spent those 3 days playing the role of the devastated father, accepting condolences, helping Melissa plan Jake's funeral, all while that burner phone burned like a coal in my jacket pocket. The key was exactly where Jake said it would be, taped under the bathroom sink in that little apartment on Maple Street. The landlord had been sympathetic when I explained that my deceased son had been considering renting the place. He let me look around one last time, said I could take whatever personal items Jake might have left behind. If he'd known what I was really there for, he might not have been so understanding. Now, watching the bank manager unlock the front doors, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. The thrill of the hunt. Not the kind of excitement you get from fishing or golf. Something darker, more primal. The satisfaction of moving chess pieces on a board that your opponent doesn't even know exists. Mr. Sullivan? The bank employee was young, maybe 25, with kind eyes and a nervous smile. I'm so sorry for your loss. Your son was always very polite when he came in. Thank you, I said, following her toward the vault. He spoke highly of this bank, said you all took good care of him. What I didn't mention was that according to Jake's records, he'd been to this safety deposit box 7 times in the 2 months before his death. Each visit carefully documented in a little notebook I'd found hidden in his car's glove compartment. A notebook that also contained license plate numbers, dates, times, and names that were starting to paint a very interesting picture. The box itself was larger than I'd expected. When the employee left me alone in the small viewing room, I lifted the lid and felt my breath catch. Jake hadn't just been collecting evidence. He'd been building a case that would make a prosecutor weep with joy. On top was the real will, the one that left everything to Emma, just like his letter had said. But underneath that were stacks of photographs, financial records, recorded conversations transcribed by hand, and a thick manila folder labeled Insurance Investigation. I opened that folder first, and what I found made me sit down hard in the metal chair. Jake hadn't just known that Melissa was planning to kill him. He'd figured out how she was going to do it, and he'd been documenting her practice runs. The photos were surveillance shots, obviously taken from a distance with a long lens. They showed Melissa meeting with a man I assumed was Tommy. Tall, thin, with the kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after seeing it. But it wasn't just the meetings that had caught Jake's attention. It was what they were doing. In photo after photo, I watched Melissa and Tommy conducting what could only be described as experiments. They had a small warehouse space somewhere on the outskirts of town, and they were testing different combinations of drugs, different injection methods, different ways to make a murder look like an accidental overdose. My hands were shaking as I flipped through the images. In one, Melissa was injecting something into what looked like a piece of fruit. In another, Tommy was holding up a syringe, examining it against the light. In a third, they had what appeared to be medical equipment laid out on a table. Heart monitors, breathing apparatus, the kind of gear you'd use to keep someone alive just long enough to stage a scene. But it was the final photo in the stack that made my blood run cold. It showed Melissa standing over what was obviously a practice dummy, positioning it on a couch, arranging its arms, adjusting its head, staging a scene. The same position I'd seen Jake's body in when I identified him at the morgue. Underneath the photos were transcripts of recorded conversations, some from the burner phone I'd already heard, others that Jake must have recorded with different equipment. Page after page of Melissa and Tommy discussing their plan, refining it, preparing for every contingency, but it wasn't just about killing Jake. As I read through the transcripts, a larger picture began to emerge. Melissa's auto repair shop wasn't just a front for drug trafficking. It was the hub of a sophisticated operation that had been running for years, moving product up and down the interstate using legitimate businesses as cover. Jake had stumbled onto something much bigger than a cheating wife. He discovered a criminal network that stretched across 3 states, involving people in law enforcement, city government, and the judicial system. And now they were all accessories to his murder. I was so absorbed in reading that I almost didn't hear the knock on the door. The bank employee was back, looking apologetic. "Mr. Sullivan? I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's a woman here asking about your son's safety deposit box. She says she's his wife." My blood turned to ice. Melissa. Somehow she'd figured out about the box. "Did you tell her anything?" I asked, quickly closing the folders and sliding them back into the box. "Oh no, sir. We can't give out any information about our customers, especially not now that, well, with your son having passed. She'd need to be listed as an authorized user or have legal documentation." "Good. That's very good." I was thinking fast now, trying to figure out how Melissa could have known about this place. Had she followed me? Had she found something in Jake's apartment that I'd missed? "Should I tell her that you're here?" "No," I said immediately. "In fact, could you do me a favor? Could you tell her that the box was closed months ago, that my son moved his belongings to another bank? I'd prefer she not know I'm here today." The young woman looked confused but nodded. "Of course, sir. Whatever you need." After she left, I sat back down and tried to think through my options. Melissa's appearance here wasn't a coincidence. She was looking for something specific, something she thought Jake might have hidden, which meant she probably knew more about his investigation than I'd initially assumed. It also meant I was running out of time. I quickly photographed every document in the box with my phone, then selected the most important items to take with me. The will, obviously. The insurance policy information. Jake's notebook with all the dates and license plates. And one other thing, a letter addressed to Detective Linda Chen at the state attorney's office. Jake had already written everything out for the authorities. A complete summary of Melissa's operation, with references to all the evidence he'd collected. All I had to do was deliver it. But as I sealed that letter back in its envelope, I realized something that Jake hadn't considered. Going to the authorities meant giving up control. It meant trusting the system to deliver justice. Trusting that Melissa and Tommy and all their associates would actually face consequences for what they'd done. It meant accepting that the man who'd raised my son, who'd loved him and tried to protect him and failed, would never get the satisfaction of looking his son's killers in the eye and watching them realize they'd made a terrible mistake. The old me would have walked straight out of that bank to Detective Chen's office. But the old me had died in that morgue 3 days ago, right alongside his son. I put the letter back in the box, along with most of the evidence, but I kept the notebook, the photos, the transcripts of Melissa's conversations, because I was beginning to formulate a plan that would give me something the legal system never could, the opportunity to make them pay exactly the way they deserved. When I walked out of that bank, Melissa was sitting in her car across the street watching the entrance. She saw me come out and waved, rolling down her window with a concerned expression. "Frank, what a coincidence. I was just running errands nearby. How are you holding up, you?" I walked over to her car, and for the first time since Jake's death, I felt completely calm, because now I knew exactly who I was dealing with, and I had the evidence to prove it. "I'm doing better," I told her. "Actually, I wanted to thank you for something." "Thank me?" "For taking such good care of Jake these past few years, for being there for him when he needed someone. It means the world to me to know that he had someone who loved him." The words tasted like poison in my mouth, but I watched Melissa's face soften, watched her defenses drop just a little. She reached out and squeezed my hand. He was a good man, Frank. A really good man. And I'm going to miss him every day. I know you will, I said. And I want you to know that you don't have to worry about anything. About money, about the future. Family takes care of family. She actually smiled at that. A real smile, not the practiced expression of grief she'd been wearing. In that moment, I saw exactly who Melissa really was. A predator who thought she'd found the perfect victim. She had no idea she'd just signed her own death warrant. The funeral was on a Thursday. Gray skies, cold rain, the kind of weather that makes you believe the universe has a sense of dramatic timing. I stood beside Jake's grave watching them lower my son into the ground, and all I could think about was the conversation I'd overheard the night before. Melissa had been on the phone in Jake's apartment, our apartment now according to her, talking to Tommy about their next moves. She thought I was asleep in the guest bedroom, exhausted from grief and funeral preparations. She had no idea I'd installed a listening device in the kitchen 3 days earlier. The old man's completely broken, she'd been saying. I actually feel a little bad about it. He really loved Jake. Tommy's voice had been less sympathetic. Good. Grieving people don't ask questions. How much you think the insurance payout will be? $200,000 from the life insurance plus whatever's in his accounts. Should be enough to expand the operation, maybe open another shop in the next town over. What Melissa didn't know, what I was counting on her not knowing, was that the life insurance policy she was expecting had been quietly canceled 6 months earlier. Jake had done it as part of transferring his assets into Emma's trust. The only insurance money that existed was a small policy through his employer that would barely cover the funeral costs. She also didn't know about the house in Colorado, the one Jake had inherited from his mother's side of the family and never mentioned to his wife. Or the 2 cars sitting in a storage facility in Denver, a 1967 Mustang and a 1970 Challenger that Jake had been restoring for years. Or the investment accounts that had been growing steadily since he'd gotten clean. By my calculations, Melissa was expecting to inherit about $300,000. The actual value of Jake's estate was closer to $1.2 million. All of it now legally belonging to Emma, my 16-year-old granddaughter, who had no idea she'd just become wealthy. Standing at that graveside, watching Melissa dab at her eyes with a tissue while mentally spending money she'd never see, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my own father died 20 years earlier. The cold satisfaction of holding all the cards in a game your opponent doesn't even know you're playing. After the service, people came back to Jake's apartment for the traditional gathering. Neighbors, co-workers, a few friends from his AA meetings. Melissa played the grieving widow perfectly, accepting condolences, talking about how lost she felt, how she didn't know how she'd manage without him. But I was watching her carefully now, and I could see the performance for what it was. The way she checked her phone every few minutes, the way her eyes kept scanning the room, cataloging Jake's possessions, probably mentally calculating their resale value. The way she excused herself twice to take calls in the bedroom. Around 8 o'clock, when the last of the guests had left, Melissa finally dropped the act. "Frank," she said, settling onto the couch beside me with a glass of wine. "I know this is difficult to talk about, but we need to discuss Jake's affairs. The lawyer wants to meet with us next week about the will." I nodded, keeping my expression appropriately somber. "Of course, whatever needs to be done." "The thing is," she continued, "Jake and I never really talked about money. He handled all the finances, and now I'm a little worried about what I'm going to find." This was it, the opening I'd been waiting for. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Well, we've been struggling lately. The shop's been slow and Jake's been... You know how it is with people in recovery. Sometimes they're not great with money management." She took a sip of wine, then looked at me with what I was beginning to recognize as her vulnerable widow expression. "I'm afraid he might have spent more than he should have." or maybe borrowed against things we can't afford to lose. It was a masterful performance. She was laying the groundwork for explaining why Jake's estate would be smaller than expected, giving herself an excuse for any assets that might suddenly disappear. If I'd been the trusting father-in-law she thought I would have offered to help her through the financial difficulties ahead. Instead, I played my part perfectly. "Melissa, honey, you don't need to worry about money. Not now, not ever." I reached over and patted her hand in what I hoped looked like paternal comfort. "Jake was my only child. Everything I have will be yours someday anyway. If there are debts, we'll handle them together. If there are assets, they'll take care of you, your family." The relief that washed over her face was so obvious it was almost comical. This was what she'd been hoping to hear, confirmation that even if Jake's estate was smaller than expected, she'd still have access to my money. What she didn't realize was that I'd just committed to something I had no intention of delivering. Because while I was perfectly willing to let her think she'd inherit from me eventually, I had no plans to die anytime soon. In fact, I was planning to live long enough to watch her world completely collapse. "Thank you, Frank," she said, and I could hear genuine emotion in her voice for the first time since Jake's death. Not grief, relief. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'll never have to find out," I assured her. Then, because I couldn't resist, I added, "Jake would want me to take care of you. That's what family does." That night, after Melissa had gone to bed, I sat in Jake's home office and pulled out all the documents I'd collected from the safety deposit box. It was time to start phase 2 of my plan. The first step was establishing contact with Emma. My granddaughter lived with her mother Rebecca in San Francisco, and we'd grown apart in recent years. Jake's addiction had created a lot of family drama, and Rebecca had made it clear that she didn't want Emma exposed to the chaos of his life. But now Jake was gone, and Emma was about to inherit a substantial estate. She had a right to know about it, and more importantly, she had a right to be protected from the people who had killed her father. I drafted a careful letter, explaining that Jake had left her some assets and that I needed to speak with her mother about the legal arrangements. I didn't mention the murder, didn't mention Melissa's involvement, didn't mention anything that might alarm Rebecca, or cause her to involve authorities before I was ready. But I did include one thing: Jake's final letter to his daughter, which I'd found sealed in an envelope at the bottom of the safety deposit box. I'd read it, of course. I'd read everything. And what Jake had written to Emma had convinced me that I was doing the right thing, not just for justice, but for family. "Emma, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me. I hope you're old enough now to understand that sometimes adults make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes have consequences we never intended. I want you to know that every day since you were born, I've been trying to become the kind of father you deserved. I haven't always succeeded. I've made choices that hurt you and your mother, and I've let my problems become your problems in ways that weren't fair. But I also want you to know that you were the reason I got clean. You were the reason I fought so hard to get my life together. Every morning when I woke up sober, it was because I wanted to be someone you could be proud of. The money I'm leaving you isn't just an inheritance, it's an apology. It's everything I should have given you while I was alive. Security, opportunity, the freedom to become whoever you want to be without worrying about whether you can afford it. Use it wisely. Use it to build something good. And remember that your grandfather Frank is one of the best men I've ever known. Trust him. He'll take care of you the way I never could. I love you, sweetheart. I'm sorry I won't be there to see the amazing woman you become, but I know you're going to do incredible things. Dad." Reading that letter had broken something inside me that I didn't know could be broken, but it had also hardened my resolve. Jake had died trying to protect his daughter from people who saw her inheritance as their opportunity. People who had murdered a man in recovery, a man who was trying to build a better life for his child. They'd made it personal. And now, I was going to show them exactly what that meant. The next morning, I mailed the letter to Emma. Then I made a phone call to a private investigator I'd found in Denver, someone Jake had actually consulted during his own investigation, according to his notebook. "Mr. Sullivan," the investigator said when I explained who I was, "I'm so sorry about your son. Jake was a good man. He was trying to do the right thing. I know he was, and I want to finish what he started." There was a pause. "Mr. Sullivan, your son gave me some information before he died. Information about his wife's activities. Are you sure you want to get involved in this?" "I'm already involved," I told him. "The question is whether you're willing to help me make sure Jake's killers face justice." "What kind of justice are we talking about?" I thought about that question for a long moment. About Jake lying in that morgue. About Melissa's performance at the funeral. About Emma reading her father's final letter 3,000 miles away. "The permanent kind," I said finally. And for the first time since my son's death, I felt like I had a reason to get up in the morning. 2 weeks after the funeral, I got the call I'd been expecting. Melissa, voice tight with panic, asking if I could come over immediately. "There was a problem with Jake's will reading," she said, something the lawyer needed to explain to both of us. I found her pacing in the living room, still in her work clothes, grease under her fingernails from the auto shop. But it wasn't the physical work that had her agitated. It was the news she'd received that afternoon from Jake's attorney. "Frank, I don't understand this," she said before I'd even sat down. "The lawyer says Jake changed his will 6 months ago. He says everything goes to Emma." I did my best to look surprised. "Everything? What about you?" That's what I asked. The mask was starting to slip now, and I could see the anger underneath her grief performance. "I mean, I understand wanting to provide for his daughter, but what about his wife? What about the woman who stood by him through recovery, who supported him, who—" She trailed off, probably realizing how self-serving she sounded. "I'm sure there's been some mistake," I said gently. "Jake wouldn't have left you with nothing." But even as I said it, I was watching her face, cataloging every micro-expression. This wasn't just disappointment I was seeing. This was fear. Raw, desperate fear. Because if Melissa wasn't inheriting Jake's money, then her entire plan had just collapsed. "The lawyer wants to see us both tomorrow morning," she continued. "He says there are some complications with the estate that we need to discuss." Complications. That was an interesting word choice, because what Melissa didn't know yet was that Jake's lawyer, David Morrison, no relation to the detective, had been very thorough in his estate planning. Not only had Jake transferred everything to Emma's trust, but he'd also included some very specific instructions about what should happen if he died under suspicious circumstances. I'd met with Morrison 3 days earlier, presenting myself as the concerned father-in-law who wanted to understand Jake's final wishes. What I'd learned during that meeting had exceeded my wildest expectations. Jake hadn't just been planning for his death. He'd been planning for his revenge. "The thing is, Frank," Morrison had told me, pulling out a thick file, "your son was very specific about his concerns regarding his wife. He suspected she was involved in criminal activity, and he was worried about what might happen to his daughter's inheritance if something happened to him." Morrison had shown me documents I hadn't seen in the safety deposit box. Legal papers that went far beyond a simple will. Jake had established Emma's trust in such a way that if his death was ruled a homicide, Melissa would be permanently barred from accessing any portion of the estate. More than that, she would be required to repay any money she'd already spent from Jake's accounts during their marriage. But the most elegant part of Jake's plan was something even more devious. He'd arranged for a forensic accountant to audit Melissa's auto shop if his death was ruled suspicious. And according to Morrison, Jake had provided enough documentation to virtually guarantee that audit would uncover evidence of money laundering, tax evasion, and racketeering charges. My son, the man I'd thought was barely holding his life together, had constructed a legal time bomb designed to explode in his killer's face. "There's one more thing," Morrison had said, lowering his voice. "Your son left specific instructions about what should happen if you ever requested access to his private investigation files. He said, and I quote, My father will know what to do with this information when the time is right. He'd handed me a sealed envelope containing everything Jake had discovered about Tommy's operation. Names, addresses, financial records, photographs of drug transactions, even detailed maps showing distribution routes across 3 states. It was enough evidence to take down a criminal network that had been operating for years. But more importantly, it was enough evidence to ensure that Melissa and Tommy would spend the rest of their lives in prison for murder, if I chose to use it. Now, sitting in Jake's living room watching Melissa struggle to process the news that her meal ticket had just evaporated, I felt that familiar cold satisfaction settling in my chest. Phase 2 was proceeding exactly as planned. "Melissa," I said, reaching over to take her hand, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. Whatever the lawyer tells us tomorrow, whatever complications there might be, you're not alone in this. We're going to figure it out together." She looked at me with something that might have been genuine gratitude if I didn't know what she was really thinking. "You mean that?" "Of course I do. You're my family now, the only family I have left." I squeezed her hand. "In fact, I've been thinking about something. This apartment, all these memories. It might be healthier for both of us if you moved in with me for a while, just until you get back on your feet." The offer surprised her. I could see her trying to figure out the angle, trying to understand what I might gain from having her in my house. But desperation makes people make poor decisions, and Melissa was becoming increasingly desperate. That's incredibly generous, Frank, but I couldn't impose on you like that. It wouldn't be an imposition, it would be a comfort." I stood up, as if the decision had just been made. "I rattle around in that big house by myself, and you shouldn't be alone here with all these painful reminders. We'll help each other through this difficult time." What I didn't tell her was that my house had been carefully prepared for her arrival. Security cameras in every room except the bathrooms and her bedroom. Recording equipment in the phones. A GPS tracker already installed in her car. Everything I needed to document her conversations with Tommy, her movements around town, her reactions as my plans slowly destroyed her life. Because while Melissa thought she was moving in with a grieving father-in-law who could be manipulated into supporting her financially, she was actually moving into what my private investigator friend had cheerfully described as the most sophisticated surveillance operation outside of federal law enforcement. The next morning's meeting with Morrison went exactly as I'd expected. Melissa sat in stunned silence as the lawyer explained that Jake's estate was not only larger than she'd realized, but completely inaccessible to her. "I don't understand," she kept saying. "We were married. Doesn't that give me any rights?" "Colorado is not a community property state," Morrison explained patiently. "And your husband was very deliberate about establishing Emma's trust as a separate entity. Unless his death is ruled accidental, and unless certain other conditions are met, you have no legal claim to any of his assets." "What other conditions?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The estate includes provisions for a forensic audit of Mrs. Sullivan's business affairs," Morrison said, consulting his notes. "If that audit reveals any irregularities that might have contributed to Mr. Sullivan's death, the trust becomes permanently sealed to anyone except Emma herself." I watched Melissa's face go pale. She was beginning to understand the trap Jake had set for her, but she didn't yet realize how comprehensive it was. "This is ridiculous," she said finally. "Jake was paranoid at the end. He was suspicious of everyone, imagining conspiracies that didn't exist. You can't punish me for his mental state." "I'm not punishing anyone," Morrison replied calmly. "I'm simply executing your husband's legal instructions. However, I should mention that if you wish to contest the will, you're certainly within your rights to do so. Of course, that would automatically trigger the forensic audit I mentioned." It was beautifully done. Jake had given Melissa a choice, except that she'd inherit nothing, or fight the will and guarantee her own destruction. Either way, she lost. But what Jake couldn't have anticipated was what I was planning to do with the information he'd left me. Because while my son had been satisfied with financial justice, I wanted something more personal. I wanted to look into Melissa's eyes when she realized that the old man she'd been planning to manipulate and rob was actually the architect of her downfall. I wanted her to understand that underestimating a 68-year-old father's capacity for revenge had been the last mistake she'd ever make as a free woman. And I wanted Tommy to know that the junkie he'd murdered had a father who played chess while Tommy was still learning checkers. After we left Morrison's office, Melissa was quiet for a long time. Finally, as we sat in my car in the parking lot, she turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Frank, I'm scared. I don't know what I'm going to do. The shop isn't making enough money to live on, and now with all this legal complexity, I might lose everything." "No, you won't," I said firmly. "I told you yesterday and I meant it. You're not going through this alone." "But what if Jake was right? What if there is some kind of audit and they find problems with my books? I'm not great with finances, and if there are mistakes—" She was fishing now, trying to gauge how much I might know about her real activities. It was almost endearing, the way she thought she could still manipulate me. "Melissa, honey, you're not a criminal. You're a small business owner who's been through a traumatic loss. If there are bookkeeping errors, we'll hire an accountant to fix them. If there are legal problems, we'll hire lawyers to resolve them." I reached over and touched her cheek in what I hoped looked like fatherly affection. "The only thing you need to worry about is taking care of yourself while you grieve." The relief in her eyes was so profound it was almost pitiful. She really believed she'd found her salvation in the form of a naive old man with deep pockets and a trusting heart. That afternoon, she started moving her things into my house. And that night, while she was unpacking in the guest room, I sat in my study reviewing the surveillance footage from her first day under my roof. 3 phone calls to Tommy, all expressing panic about the will situation and asking what their backup plan was going to be. 1 call to someone she referred to only as the lawyer. Not Morrison, but apparently someone who specialized in helping people with her particular legal problems. And 1 very interesting conversation with a woman named Sarah, who seemed to be coordinating something called the Colorado operation. My son's murderer was not just a local criminal. She was part of something much larger, much more sophisticated than I'd initially realized. And now, thanks to Jake's foresight and my own planning, I had a front row seat to watch it all fall apart. But perhaps the most satisfying moment of that first day came around midnight, when I was reviewing the audio recordings from the kitchen. Melissa, thinking I was asleep, had called Tommy one last time. "The old man is perfect," she'd whispered into the phone. "Completely clueless, totally devoted to taking care of poor grieving me. Give me 6 months and I'll have him signed up as my financial guardian or something. Maybe even talked into a new will of his own." Tommy's response had been predictably crude. "Just make sure you don't get too attached. We might need to cut loose ends when this is all over." "Don't worry about me getting attached," Melissa had replied. "This is just business. Just business." That's what my son's life had been to them. Just business. But as I turned off the recording equipment and headed to bed, I was smiling for the first time in weeks. Because while Melissa thought she was executing her backup plan, she was actually providing me with everything I needed to execute mine. And unlike her plan, mine was going to work exactly as designed. Living with Melissa was like having a venomous snake in my house. Beautiful, fascinating, and absolutely lethal if you turned your back on it. For 3 weeks, I watched her perform the role of the grieving daughter-in-law while secretly orchestrating what she believed would be my financial destruction. What she didn't realize was that every conversation, every phone call, every midnight meeting with Tommy was being recorded and documented. My private investigator had installed surveillance equipment so sophisticated that I could track her location in real time, monitor her text messages, and even access her online banking records. But the most valuable intelligence came from simply watching her routine. Melissa was a creature of habit, and those habits were painting a detailed picture of her operation. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she left the house at exactly 7 p.m., telling me she was going to grief counseling. Instead, she was meeting Tommy at various locations around town to coordinate drug shipments. I had photos of her accepting packages, photographs of her delivering them to the auto shop, video of her transferring money between accounts that didn't officially exist. On weekends, she would visit what she claimed was her sister's house across town. In reality, she was meeting with the woman named Sarah, who I now knew was the financial brains behind the entire operation. Sarah was laundering money through a network of small businesses, and Melissa's auto shop was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. But the most interesting discovery came in week 4, when Melissa received a phone call that changed everything. I was in my study, monitoring the live audio feed from her room, when her phone rang at 2 a.m. The caller ID showed a number I'd seen before in Jake's investigation files, a number traced to a man named Vincent Carrera, who apparently ran the entire Northwest corridor for this drug network. "We have a problem." Carrera's voice was calm, but cold. "The Sullivan situation is attracting attention we don't need." "What kind of attention?" Melissa sounded nervous, more nervous than I'd ever heard her. "The kind that involves federal agents asking questions about suspicious deaths in Colorado. Your husband's death is being reviewed by a multi-state task force, and they're specifically looking at connections to drug trafficking operations." My heart started pounding. Jake's murder was being investigated at the federal level, which meant that Detective Morrison had been wrong about Tommy having connections in local law enforcement. The case had been escalated beyond their reach. "That's impossible," Melissa was saying. "The local cops ruled it an overdose. End of story." Local cops don't matter when the DEA gets involved, and apparently someone has been feeding them information about our Colorado operations, detailed information, the kind that could only come from the inside. There was a long silence. Then Melissa asked the question I'd been dreading. "You think Jake was working with the feds?" "I think Jake was smarter than we gave him credit for, and I think someone else knows more about this than they're letting on." Another silence. Then Carrera's voice again, harder this time. "We need to accelerate the timeline. Whatever resources you can extract from the family, do it fast. And then we need to clean house." "What does that mean?" "It means anyone who might have access to information that could hurt us needs to be permanently silenced, including the old man." My blood turned to ice. They weren't just planning to rob me. They were planning to kill me. The conversation continued for another few minutes, with Carrera giving Melissa specific instructions about liquidating assets and preparing for a quick exit from Colorado. But I was barely listening anymore, because I'd just realized something that changed the entire game. Jake hadn't just been investigating Melissa's operation. He'd been working with federal agents. The evidence I'd found in his safety deposit box wasn't just for my benefit. It was part of an ongoing federal investigation, which meant that somewhere in the system, there were agents who knew about Melissa, knew about Tommy, and were probably wondering why their informant had suddenly gone silent. The next morning, I made a decision that would have terrified the old me. Instead of going to Detective Chen at the state attorney's office like Jake had instructed, I was going to contact the federal agents myself. Not to turn over Jake's evidence and walk away, but to offer myself as bait in a trap that would catch everyone involved in my son's murder. But first, I had to buy myself some time. That evening, while Melissa was at one of her fake grief counseling sessions, I staged what I hoped would look like a minor medical emergency. I called 911 reporting chest pains and shortness of breath. When the paramedics arrived, I was conscious but weak, describing symptoms that were consistent with cardiac stress. At the hospital, I insisted that Melissa be contacted immediately. When she arrived, I was lying in bed with oxygen tubes and heart monitors, looking every bit the part of a frightened old man who just realized his mortality. "Frank." She rushed to my bedside, tears streaming down her face. "Oh my God, I was so scared. The hospital said you might have had a heart attack." "I'm okay," I whispered, reaching for her hand. "Just a warning," the doctor said. "Too much stress, too much grief." But Melissa, it made me realize something important. "What?" "Life is short. Too short to waste time worrying about money or inheritance or legal complications." I squeezed her hand weakly. "I want to change my will. I want to make sure you're taken care of no matter what happens with Jake's estate." The transformation on her face was instant. The concern became calculation. The grief became greed. But she was smart enough to protest, at least initially. "Frank, you don't need to do that. You need to focus on getting better." "I'm serious, honey. I've already talked to my lawyer about it. I want to set up a trust for you, something that will give you financial security, even if Jake's legal mess takes years to resolve." Over the next hour, as nurses came and went and machines beeped around us, I outlined a plan that would give Melissa access to a substantial portion of my assets within 60 days. Enough money to make her believe she'd won, enough to convince her that her backup plan had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams. What I didn't tell her was that the trust I was describing didn't exist. The lawyer I claimed to have consulted was actually FBI Special Agent Linda Chen, the same Linda Chen that Jake had mentioned in his letter, who had been running the federal investigation into Vincent Carrera's network. Because while Melissa had been plotting my murder, I'd been plotting something far more sophisticated, a sting operation that would use my own apparent vulnerability as bait to catch not just her and Tommy, but everyone in their organization. Agent Chen had been surprisingly receptive when I'd called her that morning. Apparently, Jake had been one of several informants working on the Carrera investigation, and his sudden death had left them scrambling to maintain their intelligence network. "Mr. Sullivan," she'd said during our brief phone conversation, "what you're proposing is extremely dangerous. These people have already killed your son. If they suspect you're working with us—" "They've already decided to kill me," I'd replied. "At least this way their decision serves a purpose." Now, lying in that hospital bed with Melissa holding my hand and mentally spending money she'd never see, I felt a satisfaction I hadn't experienced since Jake's funeral. Because for the first time since my son's death, I was no longer reacting to their plan. I was controlling it. The next morning, the doctor released me with instructions to avoid stress and follow up with a cardiologist. Melissa drove me home, chattering excitedly about taking care of me, making sure I ate properly, maybe hiring a home health aide if necessary. What she was really doing was making sure I stayed alive long enough to sign the documents that would give her access to my money. After that, Vincent Carrera's timeline would kick in, and I'd become another suspicious death that local authorities would hopefully rule accidental. But as we pulled into my driveway, I noticed something that made me smile. There was a new van parked across the street, one that hadn't been there when we left for the hospital. Inside, barely visible through tinted windows, I could see the silhouette of someone with binoculars and what looked like recording equipment. Agent Chen had moved fast. The federal surveillance net was already in place. That night, as I lay in bed listening to Melissa make her phone calls to Tommy and Sarah and Vincent, coordinating the final phase of what they thought was their master plan, I felt something I hadn't felt since Jake was a child. The deep satisfaction of a father protecting his family. Because while they'd been planning to kill an old man for his money, I'd been planning to destroy an entire criminal network for my son. And unlike their plan, mine was going to succeed. The game was almost over. They just didn't know it yet. The meeting was set for Thursday night. Vincent Carrera himself was coming to Colorado to oversee what he called the final phase of asset recovery. According to the conversations I'd been monitoring, this was going to be bigger than just killing me for my money. They were planning to eliminate all potential witnesses to Jake's murder, liquidate every asset they could access, and disappear before the federal investigation could get any closer to them. What they didn't know was that Agent Chen and her team had been using my house as a control center for 3 days, monitoring communications across the entire network. Every phone call, every text message, every financial transaction was being recorded and traced back to its source. But the most important thing they didn't know was that I'd discovered something even Jake hadn't found: the location where they'd killed my son. Tommy had made a mistake during one of his late-night phone calls with Melissa. He'd mentioned cleaning up the warehouse space where they'd conducted their test runs, and he'd given specific directions to a storage facility on the outskirts of town. When I'd passed this information to Agent Chen, she'd sent a forensics team to the location. What they found there had elevated this from a drug trafficking case to something much more serious. The warehouse wasn't just where Tommy and Melissa had practiced staging overdoses. It was where they'd murdered at least 4 other people over the past 2 years. People who had gotten too close to their operation or threatened to expose them. Jake wasn't their first victim. He was just their most carefully planned one. Agent Chen had shown me the crime scene photographs, and I'd had to excuse myself to throw up. Not just because of what they'd done to those people, but because of how methodical they'd been about it. Each murder had been staged to look like an accident or suicide. Each victim had been someone with a history of addiction or mental health issues, people whose deaths wouldn't generate too much investigation. Jake had figured this out in his final weeks. That's why he'd been so paranoid, so desperate to get evidence to the authorities. He'd realized that he wasn't just married to a drug dealer, he was married to a serial killer. Now, as I sat in my study on Thursday evening, waiting for Vincent Carrera to arrive, I was wearing a wire that would broadcast everything to Agent Chen's team. The plan was simple. Let Carrera and his people incriminate themselves as thoroughly as possible, then move in for arrests. What could go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. Melissa came into my study at exactly 8 p.m., looking nervous but determined. Behind her were 2 men I'd never seen before, not Tommy, who was apparently handling logistics elsewhere, but 2 professionals who looked like they'd stepped out of a crime movie. "Frank," Melissa said, her voice artificially calm, "these are some business associates of mine. They wanted to meet you before we finalized the trust arrangements." The taller of the 2 men stepped forward, and I immediately knew this was Vincent Carrera. He had the kind of face that looked friendly until you saw his eyes, which were as cold and empty as a shark's. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Vincent. I wanted to thank you personally for being so generous to Melissa during this difficult time." As I shook his hand, I felt him squeeze just a little too hard, just long enough to make it clear that he was evaluating me as a threat. When he let go, his smile never wavered, but I could see him making calculations. "It's my pleasure," I replied. "Melissa is family. Family takes care of family." "That's a beautiful sentiment," Carrera said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "And it's exactly the kind of thinking that makes what we're doing here so much easier." The second man, who hadn't been introduced, moved to stand by the window, not looking out, looking at me, making sure I understood the dynamics in the room. "Now," Carrera continued, "Melissa tells me you're willing to establish a substantial trust fund to help her through this transition period. That's very generous of you, but I have to ask, are you sure you've thought this through completely?" There was something in his tone that made my skin crawl. This wasn't a business negotiation. This was a predator playing with its food. "I've thought about it very carefully," I said. "Jake would want me to take care of his wife." "Would he?" Carrera's smile grew wider. "Because from what I understand, Jake had some very specific ideas about what Melissa deserved. In fact, he went to considerable effort to make sure she didn't inherit anything from him." My heart was pounding, but I tried to keep my expression neutral. Jake was confused at the end. The stress of recovery, the financial pressure. I think he made some decisions he might have regretted. "Oh, I don't think Jake regretted anything," Carrera said softly. "I think Jake knew exactly what he was doing. Just like I think you know exactly what you're doing, Mr. Sullivan." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Melissa was looking between Carrera and me with growing alarm, and the man by the window had moved his hand inside his jacket. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew the game was over. Somehow Carrera had figured out that I was more than just a grieving father-in-law. "What I mean," Carrera said, standing up slowly, "is that Jake Sullivan was a federal informant. And what I mean is that federal agents have been monitoring this house for at least a week. And what I mean is that you, Mr. Frank Sullivan, are wearing a wire right now and hoping to record a confession that will put us all in prison for the rest of our lives." Melissa gasped. "Frank, what is he talking about?" But I was already moving, diving toward the desk drawer where I kept the .38 revolver I'd bought after Jake's death. I'd hoped I wouldn't need it, hoped that Agent Chen's team would move in before things escalated. I was wrong. Carrera's associate was faster than me, but not faster than the front door of my house exploding inward as FBI agents in tactical gear swarmed into the room. The next 30 seconds were chaos, shouting, gunshots, Melissa screaming, furniture overturning as bodies hit the floor. When it was over, Carrera's associate was dead, shot by federal agents after he'd pulled a gun on me. Carrera himself was on the ground with his hands zip-tied behind his back, blood running from his nose where Agent Chen had tackled him into the bookshelf. And Melissa. Melissa was sitting in the corner, staring at me with an expression of absolute hatred. "You son of a bitch," she whispered. You knew everything." "I knew you murdered my son," I replied, getting to my feet and brushing plaster dust off my clothes. "I knew you were planning to murder me, and I knew that you'd made the mistake of underestimating a father's love for his child." Agent Chen was kneeling beside me, checking to make sure I wasn't injured. "Are you okay, Mr. Sullivan?" "I'm fine, but I want to know something." I looked down at Carrera, who was glaring up at me with pure malice. "How did you figure it out? How did you know I was working with the FBI?" Carrera started to laugh, a sound that made me want to hit him. "Your son was smarter than you gave him credit for, old man. But he wasn't smart enough. He left a voicemail for his handler the night before we killed him, talking about the insurance policy he'd arranged with his father. We found that voicemail 2 days ago." My blood went cold. Jake had tried to protect me, but he'd also accidentally revealed my involvement to his killers. They'd been planning to kill me from the moment they learned I existed. "But here's the thing you didn't consider," Carrera continued, his smile returning. "We've been planning this for a lot longer than you have, and while you've been playing detective, we've been eliminating every loose end in our operation." "What are you talking about?" Agent Chen demanded. Carrera's eyes shifted to her. "I'm talking about the other witnesses, the people who might have been able to corroborate Jake Sullivan's testimony, the people who are dying right now, all across Colorado, while you've been playing this little game." The room went silent except for the sound of Agent Chen's radio crackling to life. Voice after voice, reporting the same thing. Suspected homicides at locations across the state. A coordinated strike designed to eliminate everyone who might have been able to testify against Carrera's organization. "You see?" Carrera said, his voice filled with satisfaction. "Even if you convict me, even if you shut down my operation, you'll never be able to prove I killed your son, because everyone who could have testified about it is dead." But as I stared down at this man who had orchestrated my son's murder, who had just ordered the deaths of innocent people to protect himself, I realized something that made me smile for the first time in weeks. "You're wrong about one thing," I told him. "What's that?" "Jake didn't just leave evidence with the FBI. He left evidence with someone else. Someone you'll never find. Someone who's been waiting for exactly this moment to come forward." Carrera's confidence wavered slightly. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about my granddaughter Emma, the one who's been recording every phone conversation she's had with Melissa for the past month. Ever since I told her the truth about how her father died." The color drained from Melissa's face. "That's impossible. I never called Emma." "No," I agreed. "But you called Jake's phone plenty of times after he died, didn't you? The phone that's been forwarding to Emma's number since the day of the funeral. The phone Jake programmed to record every call automatically." Agent Chen was staring at me. "Mr. Sullivan, are you saying—" "I'm saying my son set up a dead man's switch. Every conversation Melissa has had for the past month, every call to Tommy, every call to Vincent, every discussion of their plans, has been recorded and automatically uploaded to a secure server that Emma controls." Carrera was no longer smiling. "You're bluffing." "Agent Chen," I said calmly, "I think you should call Special Agent Martinez in San Francisco. I believe Emma Sullivan is waiting for your call." As Chen pulled out her phone, I looked down at Vincent Carrera one more time. The man who had killed my son, who had planned to kill me, who thought he was smart enough to outmaneuver a grieving father. You were right about one thing, I told him. Jake was smarter than you gave him credit for. But you made one critical mistake. What mistake? You assumed that when you killed him, his plan died with him. But Jake knew he was going to die, and he made sure that even from the grave he'd have the last word. Carrera closed his eyes, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked like what he really was, a man who'd finally run out of moves. The game was over, and we'd won. The aftermath moved faster than I'd expected. Within 72 hours, Agent Chen's team had arrested 43 people across 4 states, dismantling what the media was calling one of the most sophisticated drug trafficking and money laundering operations in the region. But for me, the numbers didn't matter. What mattered was watching Melissa Sullivan being led away in handcuffs, knowing that she'd spend the rest of her life in prison for murdering my son. The recordings Emma had provided were devastating. Hours of Melissa discussing not just Jake's murder, but the murders of 6 other people over the past 3 years. The forensic evidence from the warehouse corroborated everything, and when Tommy finally broke under interrogation, he provided details that sealed everyone's fate. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came during Melissa's arraignment, when she finally looked at me across that courtroom and understood exactly how completely she'd been outplayed. I was sitting in the front row, wearing my best suit, looking every inch the respectable father-in-law she'd thought she could manipulate. When her eyes met mine, I saw the exact moment she realized that everything, from Jake's paranoid will changes to my accidental discovery of the safety deposit box to my spontaneous decision to let her move into my house, had been orchestrated. Her lawyer was arguing for bail, claiming she was a grieving widow with no flight risk. But when Melissa looked at me, she whispered something to her attorney that made him stop mid-sentence and request a brief recess. During the break, Agent Chen sat down beside me. "What do you think she just figured out?" "That I'm not the man she thought I was," I replied, "and that neither was my son." When court resumed, Melissa's lawyer made a different argument entirely. He claimed his client had been manipulated and coerced by more sophisticated criminals, that she was as much a victim as anyone else. It was a desperate play, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. The judge denied bail. Melissa Sullivan would remain in custody until her trial, which was scheduled to begin in 6 months. But the real closure came 2 weeks later, when I received a phone call from Emma. My granddaughter was 17 now, a senior in high school, and far more mature than I'd given her credit for. When I'd first contacted her about her father's death and the inheritance he'd left her, she'd been grief-stricken, but not entirely surprised. "I knew something was wrong," she told me during that first conversation. "Dad had been calling me more often, and he seemed scared. He kept telling me he loved me, like he was saying goodbye." Emma had been the one to suggest using Jake's phone as a recording device. She'd remembered him showing her the app he'd installed, the one that automatically backed up voicemails and call recordings to a secure cloud server. When I'd told her about Melissa's late-night phone calls, Emma had realized we could use her father's paranoia against his killers. Now, calling me from San Francisco where she was preparing to testify at the trial, Emma sounded older, sadder, but also stronger than before. "Grandpa Frank," she said, "I want you to know something. What you did, what Dad did, it wasn't just about getting justice for his murder. You saved other people's lives." She was right. The investigation had revealed that Carrera's organization had been planning to eliminate at least a dozen more potential witnesses. People who had sold drugs for them, people who had laundered money, people who simply knew too much about their operations. Our sting hadn't just caught Jake's killers, it had prevented a massacre. "Your father saved those lives," I told her. "I just followed his plan." "No," Emma said firmly. "Dad left evidence. But you made sure the right people saw it. You put yourself at risk to make sure his plan worked, and now I get to go to college knowing that the people who killed my father will never hurt anyone else." There was a pause. Then she asked the question I'd been dreading. "What happens now, Grandpa?" with all the money Dad left me, with everything that's changed. I'd been thinking about this for weeks. Emma was about to inherit more than $1 million, but she was also inheriting the weight of how that money had been preserved. The knowledge that her father had died protecting it, that I'd risked my life to make sure she received it. What happens now is whatever you want to happen, I told her. That money is yours to use however you think your father would want you to use it. College, travel, starting a business, helping other people. It's your choice. I've been thinking about that, she said. And I want to do something Dad would be proud of. Something that helps other families like ours. She went on to tell me about a foundation she wanted to establish. One that would provide support services for families affected by drug violence. Legal aid, counseling, financial assistance for people trying to escape dangerous situations. She wanted to call it the Jake Sullivan Foundation for Family Justice. As she described her plans, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Jake's death. Hope. Not just for Emma's future, but for the possibility that something good could come from all the pain and loss we'd endured. There's something else, Emma continued. I want you to run it with me. I know you're retired, but you understand how these criminals think, how they operate, and you know what it feels like to almost lose everything to them. The offer surprised me. I'd assumed that once the trial was over, once justice had been served, I'd go back to my quiet life in Colorado and try to find some kind of peace. But Emma was offering me something different. The chance to turn my experience into a weapon against the kind of people who had destroyed my son. I'm an old man, Emma. I don't know how much help I'd be. You're 68 years old and you just took down a criminal organization that the FBI had been trying to crack for 3 years, she replied, and I could hear the smile in her voice. I think you'd be more help than you realize. That night, after I hung up with Emma, I sat in my study looking at the photographs of Jake I kept on my desk. Pictures of him as a child, as a young man, and one final photo from his last birthday. Clean, sober, hopeful about his future. I thought about everything that had happened since that phone call at 3:47 a.m. The investigation, the deception, the danger, the ultimate triumph over the people who had taken him from us. And I realized that while I'd succeeded in getting justice for Jake's murder, I'd also discovered something about myself I'd never known existed. I was good at this. Good at seeing through deception, good at planning complex operations, good at staying calm under pressure. All those years I'd spent as a middle manager, thinking I was ordinary, thinking I was just another face in the crowd. I'd been wrong about myself. Jake's death had revealed capabilities I'd never needed to use before, and Emma was right. Those capabilities could help other people in situations like ours. The next morning, I called Agent Chen to discuss something that had been on my mind since the arrests. During the investigation, she'd mentioned that the FBI was always looking for civilian consultants, people with specialized knowledge or experience who could help with ongoing cases. Mr. Sullivan, she said when I explained what I was thinking, are you seriously considering working with us on other cases? I'm considering it, I replied. I learned a lot about how these organizations operate, about how they think, about their weaknesses. If that knowledge could help other families avoid what Emma and I went through. There was a long pause. Then Chen said something that surprised me. We've actually been hoping you'd call. There are 3 other cases currently under investigation that have similarities to the Carrera network. Cases where we suspect family members have been killed to prevent them from testifying or revealing information about drug operations. She went on to explain that while the FBI had excellent technical resources and investigative procedures, they often struggled with cases that required what she called social engineering, the kind of deep undercover work that required suspects to trust and confide in someone they perceived as harmless. You have a profile that makes you perfect for that kind of work, she said. Older, respectable, not someone criminals would immediately see as a threat. And after what you did with Melissa, we know you can maintain a cover identity under extreme pressure. The idea should have terrified me. 6 months earlier, I'd been a retired insurance adjuster whose biggest concern was whether to plant tomatoes or peppers in my garden. Now I was being recruited by the FBI to help investigate murder cases. But instead of fear, I felt that familiar cold satisfaction settling in my chest. The same feeling I'd had when I'd first listened to Jake's recordings, when I'd realized that his killers had underestimated both of us. "There's one condition," I told Agent Chen. "Whatever cases you want my help with, Emma gets to be involved too. She's going to be running a foundation that helps families affected by this kind of violence, and she deserves to see how justice actually works. That's unusual, but given her contributions to this case, I think we can work something out." 2 months later, Emma flew out to Colorado to attend Melissa's sentencing hearing. It was the first time I'd seen my granddaughter in person since Jake's funeral, and I was struck by how much she'd changed. She was still 17, still grieving her father's loss, but there was something new in her eyes. A hardness, a determination that reminded me of myself in the weeks after Jake's death. The hearing itself was anticlimactic. Melissa's lawyer had negotiated a plea deal. Life in prison without possibility of parole in exchange for her testimony against Vincent Carrera and the remaining members of his organization. She would never see freedom again, but she would avoid the death penalty. When the judge asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, Melissa stood and turned to look at Emma and me in the gallery. "I want you to know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "that I loved Jake. I really did love him. But love doesn't pay debts, and it doesn't protect you from people like Vincent Carrera." It was a pathetic attempt at an explanation, an effort to make herself seem like another victim rather than the calculating murderer she actually was. But I could see it wasn't working. Even her own lawyer looked embarrassed by her statement. Emma leaned over to me and whispered, "Dad would have said she's still lying to herself." She was right. Jake would have seen through Melissa's final performance just like he'd seen through everything else. And he would have been proud to know that his death had been the beginning of something larger, something that would help other families avoid the pain we'd endured. After the sentencing, Emma and I drove to Jake's grave. It was the first time she'd been able to visit since moving to California, and I watched her kneel beside the headstone and talk quietly to her father about everything that had happened. "We did it, Dad," she said finally. "We got them all, and now we're going to help other people do the same thing." Standing there in that cemetery, looking at my son's name carved in granite, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year. Peace. Not the absence of pain. I would carry that grief for the rest of my life. But the deep satisfaction of knowing that Jake's death had meaning beyond just loss. He'd saved Emma's inheritance. He'd exposed a criminal network. He'd prevented other murders. And through his careful planning and sacrifice, he'd turned his father from a naive old man into someone capable of fighting back against the people who prey on families like ours. That evening, over dinner at the hotel where Emma was staying before flying back to California, she asked me something I'd been expecting. "Grandpa, are you going to be okay doing this kind of work? Going after people like Melissa and Vincent? It's dangerous, and you've already lost so much." I thought about her question for a long moment. About Jake's warning that I should be careful, about my promise to him that his family would be protected, about the other families who might be facing what we'd faced. "Emma," I said finally, "for 67 years of my life, I was someone who played by the rules and trusted other people to do the right thing. I was someone who believed that if you worked hard and stayed honest, good things would happen to you. And now I know that sometimes the people who need protection the most are the ones who can't protect themselves. And sometimes the only way to stop evil people is to be smarter, more determined, and more ruthless than they are." She nodded slowly. "Dad would say that's what he learned in recovery. That you can't just hope things will get better, you have to fight for them. Your father was a wise man, Emma. Wiser than I gave him credit for while he was alive." I reached across the table and took her hand. But he also taught me something else. He taught me that family isn't just about loving each other. It's about protecting each other no matter what the cost. 3 weeks later, Agent Chen called with details about our first joint case. A family in Nevada whose son had supposedly committed suicide, but whose death bore striking similarities to Jake's murder. A grieving father who suspected his daughter-in-law of involvement, but couldn't get local authorities to take his concerns seriously. "Are you ready for this?" Chen asked. I looked at the photographs she'd sent me. A young man who looked remarkably like Jake. A wife whose grief seemed performed rather than genuine. A father whose pain was written across every line of his face. "I'm ready," I told her. "When do we start?" Because if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that evil people count on good people being too scared, too trusting, or too naive to fight back effectively. They count on families being too devastated by loss to think clearly, too overwhelmed by grief to see the patterns, too isolated to know where to turn for help. Jake's killers had counted on exactly those things. They'd seen a recovering addict with a history of poor decisions and figured he'd be easy to eliminate. They'd seen an aging father-in-law and assumed he'd be easy to manipulate. They'd been wrong on both counts. And now, thanks to my son's sacrifice and my granddaughter's courage, other families wouldn't have to face these predators alone. The game had changed. And we were the ones changing it. It's been 2 years since Jake's death, and as I write this, I'm sitting in my study preparing for what will be my 7th undercover operation with the FBI. The Jake Sullivan Foundation for Family Justice has helped 43 families obtain justice for suspicious deaths, and we've assisted in the prosecution of over 100 criminals involved in drug trafficking, money laundering, and murder-for-hire schemes. But before I tell you about where this journey has taken Emma and me, I want to share something that happened last week that reminded me why we do this work. I received a letter from a woman named Patricia Chen in Oregon. Not Agent Chen, a different Chen entirely, a mother whose 19-year-old daughter had supposedly overdosed 6 months earlier. Patricia had read about our foundation online and reached out because something about her daughter's death didn't feel right. "Mr. Sullivan," her letter began, "I know how crazy this must sound, but I think my daughter's boyfriend killed her. The police say it was an accidental overdose, but Sarah had been clean for 8 months. She was going to community college, working part-time, planning for her future. And this boyfriend, there's something about him that makes my skin crawl." The details Patricia provided were hauntingly familiar. A daughter in recovery who'd been making positive changes in her life. A boyfriend who'd appeared supportive, but had access to drugs and questionable associates. A death that occurred just as the daughter was planning to end the relationship and move away from the area. Most telling of all, the boyfriend had taken out a life insurance policy on Patricia's daughter just 3 months before her death, claiming it was a sign of his commitment to their future together. I'd seen this pattern 6 times now. Young people in recovery, vulnerable and grateful for what appears to be genuine love and support, targeted by predators who see their addiction history as the perfect cover for murder. Insurance policies, asset transfers, convenient deaths that local authorities attribute to relapse rather than homicide. Jake hadn't been the victim of a random crime or even a simple case of greed. He'd been targeted by people who had turned the vulnerabilities of addiction into a business model. People who specifically sought out recovering addicts as both drug distribution partners and murder victims. This realization had led Emma and me to specialize in cases involving addiction and recovery, working with a network of federal agents, private investigators, and forensic specialists who understood the unique challenges these cases presented. Our success rate has been remarkable, not because we're exceptionally skilled, but because the criminals who prey on recovering addicts tend to underestimate their victims' families the same way they underestimated Jake's family. They see grieving parents and grandparents as obstacles to be managed rather than adversaries to be respected. It's a mistake they usually make only once. Patricia Chen's case became our most complex operation yet. Her daughter's boyfriend, Marcus Webb, wasn't just a small-time criminal like Tommy. He was part of a network that specifically recruited women in recovery, used them to distribute drugs until they became liabilities, then eliminated them for their life insurance payouts. The investigation took 4 months, and involved Emma going undercover as a college student in recovery, attending the same support group meetings where Marcus recruited his victims. It was dangerous work, the kind that Agent Chen initially refused to approve until Emma pointed out that she was the only person on our team who could credibly pose as a recovering addict Marcus's age. Watching my granddaughter put herself at risk to help another family get justice was simultaneously the most terrifying and most proud moment of my life since Jake's death. But Emma had inherited more than just her father's money. She'd inherited his courage and his commitment to protecting others. The operation culminated in Marcus attempting to murder Emma in exactly the same way he'd killed Patricia's daughter. But this time, federal agents were watching, recording, and waiting to move in the moment he committed himself to the crime. When Marcus was arrested, he was carrying enough evidence to connect him to 11 suspicious deaths across 3 states. 11 families who had lost children to what they'd thought were accidental overdoses or suicides, but which were actually carefully planned murders. Patricia Chen flew out to Colorado for Marcus's sentencing hearing, and afterward, she asked me the same question I'd been asking myself for 2 years. "How do you do it?" she said. "How do you put yourself through this over and over again, reliving your son's death every time you help another family?" It was a fair question. Every case we worked did bring back memories of Jake's murder, did force me to confront again and again the fact that I hadn't been able to save my own son. There were nights when I woke up in a cold sweat, replaying conversations with Melissa, wondering if I could have done something differently, something that might have kept Jake alive. But then I would remember something Jake had written in his final letter to Emma. Maybe I can still do one right thing. Maybe I can still protect the people I love. I do it because Jake can't, I told Patricia. My son spent the last weeks of his life trying to protect other people from the criminals who eventually killed him. Now I get to finish what he started. That's what keeps me going when the work gets difficult, when the dangers feel too real, when the grief threatens to overwhelm the anger. Jake's death wasn't meaningless if it leads to justice for other families. His sacrifice isn't wasted if it prevents other parents from going through what I went through. Emma puts it differently. She says we do this work because we're uniquely qualified for it, not because we're naturally brave or exceptionally skilled, but because we understand the stakes in a way that other people don't. We know what it feels like to be targeted by predators who think they're smarter than their victims' families. We know what it's like to discover that someone you trusted was planning to kill you for money. Most importantly, we know what it feels like to win. Tomorrow, Emma and I fly to Michigan to begin our 8th case together. Another suspicious death, another grieving family, another network of criminals who think they've committed the perfect crime. They haven't. But they're about to discover what Jake's killers learned 2 years ago. That underestimating a determined family is the last mistake you ever want to make. If you're watching this video because you've lost someone under circumstances that don't feel right, if you suspect that a death in your family wasn't really an accident or suicide, if local authorities have dismissed your concerns because of your loved one's history with addiction or mental health issues, I want you to know something. You're not crazy. Your instincts matter. And you're not alone. The Jake Sullivan Foundation for Family Justice exists to help families like yours, families who need resources and support that the traditional justice system can't always provide. We can't bring back the people you've lost, but we can help you find the truth about what happened to them. And if they were murdered, we can help you make sure their killers face consequences. But more than that, I want you to understand something that took me 68 years to learn. You are stronger than you know. You are more capable than your enemies believe. And when you're fighting for justice for someone you love, there's no limit to what you can accomplish. Jake taught me that. Even in death, he taught me that. My son was killed by people who thought a recovering addict would be an easy target, people who assumed his family would be too trusting and too naive to see through their deceptions. They were wrong about Jake, and they were wrong about us. If you're facing similar predators, if you're dealing with people who think your grief makes you weak and your loss makes you vulnerable, I have one piece of advice for you. Let them underestimate you. Use their arrogance against them. Be patient. be smart, and be absolutely ruthless in your pursuit of the truth. Because at the end of the day, the most dangerous opponent you can face isn't someone who's bigger or stronger or more violent than you are. It's someone who loves their family more than they fear your threats. Someone who has nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Someone who's willing to spend every remaining day of their life making sure you pay for what you've done. Jake's killers learned that lesson too late to save themselves. But it's not too late for other families to learn it in time to save each other. The game isn't over. It's just beginning. And this time, we know the rules. If this story has touched you, if it's made you think about the hidden dangers that families like ours face every day, I want you to do something for me. Subscribe to this channel, share this video, and leave a comment telling me about your own experiences with loss, with injustice, with the fight for truth in an often indifferent world. Because every family that finds justice, every criminal who faces consequences, every life that's saved because someone refused to accept an easy answer to a hard question, that's Jake's legacy. That's how his death becomes something more than just another tragedy. That's how we make sure the people we've lost are never really gone. Thank you for listening to our story. Thank you for caring about families you've never met. And thank you for understanding that sometimes the most important battles are fought not by soldiers or police officers or federal agents, but by ordinary people who refuse to let evil win. The Jake Sullivan Foundation for Family Justice is real, and we're here to help. Because no family should have to face these predators alone. And no parent should have to learn the way I did, that love isn't just about holding your children close. Sometimes it's about hunting down the people who took them away from you. Jake would be proud of the work we're doing. But more than that, he'd be proud to know that his death has made it impossible for people like Melissa and Vincent Carrera to operate in the shadows anymore. The light of justice is shining brighter now. And that light carries his name.